My name is Kayla Thompson, and I'm a manager of school programs with Alive and Well Communities. Today, we will be talking about implicit bias and microaggressions, examining ourselves and our institutions. Throughout our training today, we want to return to this goal. How can we change the question we ask others from, "What's wrong with you?" or "What's your problem?" to "What happened to you?" What happened to you? We may also rephrase the question to something like, "What's going on?" or "How can I help you get through this moment today?" The object is to remove blame from a situation and turn the focus on the experience of the person whom we are dealing with and to discover the underlying cause of their behavior or their words so we can move into a space of understanding and healing. Studies show that every person only needs one unwavering, buffering, supportive person in their life to change the trajectory of trauma. So, what is unconscious bias? Well, unconscious bias is a natural human condition. Research tells us that human beings have a natural tendency to place individuals into social categories. The unconscious brain uses social assumptions to develop biases. For example, if we're constantly exposed to women as primary school teachers or receptionists and men as plumbers or organizational leaders, these associations become wired into our brains. Our unconscious brain, which works on facts and data, has very little capacity and processes slowly, whereas our unconscious brain is habit and intuition driven with a huge capacity and has the ability to recognize patterns and things into categories, allowing them to deal with all the known and non dangerous issues and keep only those unknown and dangerous issues to the conscious brain. We all have biases. We're aware of many of them, but sometimes they are subconscious and reflect our cultural and social experiences. No matter how unbiased we think we are, these aspects of human nature shapes us by how we interact with people and how we make decisions. They are blind spots to our rational decision making, and we're unaware that it exists. So, what's an explicit bias? With explicit biases, individuals are aware of their prejudices and attitudes toward certain groups. Overt racism and racist comments are examples of explicit biases. So, why should we examine our biases? Because implicit biases are unconscious automatic associations that may contradict our conscious attitudes and what we believe we think about others. It's important to examine how our biases cause us to interact with others, especially if we are in a position of power or privilege over another. Implicit biases can influence our behavior and reactions to another person, which can sometimes lead to detrimental outcomes. What are some of those detrimental outcomes? Well, in the healthcare industry, implicit bias is among the likely culprits in many persistent racial and ethnic disparities, like infant and maternal mortality rate, chronic diseases such as diabetes, and more recently, COVID 19. Black Americans are about 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID 19 relative to whites. And emerging data indicate that Native Americans are also disproportionately suffering from the pandemic. Implicit biases may impact the way in which clinicians and other healthcare professionals diagnose and treat people of color, leading to worse outcomes. One study by the Yale Child Center found that Black children, and Black boys in particular, were more likely to be expelled from school for behavioral issues. When teachers were told to watch for challenging behaviors, they were more likely to focus on Black children than on white children. Research shows that even when Black and white students commit the same type of infraction, like fighting, Black students on average receive nearly a day longer of suspension. The presence of law enforcement officers in school has led to a significant increase in the criminalization of school misconduct, and its impacts are not proportional to the population. Black students are more likely to have the cops called on them and are also more likely to be arrested when they are called. School based arrests are part of the larger scale discipline disparities that contribute to a school to prison pipeline for Black and Brown students. So, we're going to take a moment to discuss. I want you to discuss with a partner, with a group, or text a friend. What stories do you hear about your school district, school building from others? Discuss in groups with colleagues from other districts, friends with other occupations, or other outsiders say about your school. We'll pause here. Now, I want us to discuss what stories do we tell ourselves? Think about what you may have said or heard other teachers say about your school district, building, classroom, or students. What are some of the common themes? What do you notice about the stories we tell? Let's take a moment to pause here. Now we'll watch a video. We all have implicit biases. So, what can we do about it?
I want to make an argument to you. I want to make a case to you. And the argument that I want to make is that the way that we currently think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. The way we think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. And in making this case, I want to build on the very robust and compelling evidence that has been coming out of the science community for the past 10 plus years that suggests that if we want to move to a radically different place, a radically better place on issues of race and difference in this country, we have to pay attention to something called implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? Oprah Winfrey has talked about it. Malcolm Gladwell has written about it. Normally we say when Oprah is talking about it and Malcolm is writing about it, everybody knows about it, which isn't always the case. So a bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a person or a group of people. There are three characteristics that make a bias implicit. Characteristic number one, implicit biases operate at the subconscious level, outside of conscious awareness. We don't know that we have them, and they can't be accessed through introspection. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that none of us can sit here in this room right now, scratch our heads, and wonder out loud, do I have a bias against men, against women, against black people, against white people, against immigrants, and expect to accurately answer that question, because the nature of an implicit bias is such that we don't know that we have it. Characteristic number two, implicit biases oftentimes run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs about who we are as human beings and what our values are. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that you can be a school administrator and say that you are deeply committed to nurturing and building up young people, and yet be the same school administrator who leads your school in high rates of suspensions and expulsions of young people. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to building young people up. Unconsciously, you're doing harm in the process. The science of implicit bias says that you can be a law enforcement officer deeply committed to the mantra that appears on the side of police vehicles that says what? Protect and serve. And yet be the same law enforcement officer who leads your precinct or your district in high rates of stops and frisks of young men of color. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to the principles of protecting and serving. Unconsciously, your behavior is inconsistent with that. The third characteristic that makes a bias implicit is that implicit biases are triggered through rapid and automatic mental associations that we make between people, ideas, and objects, and the attitudes and stereotypes that we hold about those people, ideas, and objects. And so, case in point, want to do a quick exercise around the power of mental association. So in a minute, I'm going to flash a few words on the screen. And what I want to ask you to do is I want you to quickly reflect on and or call out the associations that you make with those words or that you believe the broader society makes with those words. And so this requires a little bit of call and response. So, government, corporate, suburbs, subsidized housing. So the science of implicit bias would say that those associations that you just made, those aren't mere verbal associations. Those aren't mere mental associations. The science says that there are attitudes and behaviors that we attach to those associations. So imagine if, as part of my introduction, I came out here and I said, my name is Deshaw. I want to talk with you about something innovative. And I'm here representing local government. I used to work in corporate America. I was born and raised in subsidized housing, but I now live in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia. The science would suggest that for many of you, for those who said that your automatic mental association with government is corrupt, or your automatic mental association with corporate is greed, you would receive me through that filter, oftentimes at the unconscious level. And it would color for you every single word that comes out of my mouth. So that's how implicit bias works. These rapid and automatic mental associations that shape and mold behavior every single day, oftentimes in ways that we're not even aware of, oftentimes in ways that do harm to others. So there are three reasons why focusing on implicit bias at this particular moment in time is important, and why I believe that a focus on implicit bias can help move this country forward. So, number one, an implicit bias focus gives us a much more expansive diagnosis of the challenges that we face in this country with respect to difference. What do I mean? We know from the work of esteemed scholars Mazrin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald that a significant amount of the harm being experienced and transmitted in this country with respect to racial bias and other lines of difference, we know that a significant amount of that harm stems from implicit forms of bias in addition to explicit forms of bias. Yet the majority of the tools that we use to address bias are designed to address explicit forms, not the implicit. So in essence, what we have in this country is a mismatch, a disconnect between how we diagnose challenges around difference and how we treat them. An implicit bias approach gives us a much more expansive diagnosis and a much more expansive toolbox. And my belief is that if we get the diagnosis right, we will get the treatment right. If we continue to get the diagnosis wrong, we will get the treatment. Number two, implicit bias is both predictive and it's preventive. Predictive in the sense that a person can go to the website for Project Implicit, take any one of the online implicit association tests, and receive a test result that can serve as a predictor of discriminatory behavior. It's preventive in the sense that there are emerging and promising strategies coming out of the science community that suggest with internal motivation and habitual practice, we can do things to reduce our vulnerability to act on our biases. And I believe that that is what the country needs right now. We need a prevention approach around issues of bias and difference versus an emergency room response. Right now, we have an emergency room response. We wait for stuff to happen, then we rush to the emergency room. We need a prevention approach. and implicit bias gives us that. Lastly, and number 3, implicit bias, or an implicit bias approach, helps to reduce the shame and the shaming that's associated with talking about and addressing issues of bias. Author and researcher Brene Brown draws an interesting distinction between guilt and shame. She says, guilt says, I made a mistake and I can do something about it. Shame says, I am a mistake. This is who I am. I'm a horrible human being. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to always be this way. And what I want to submit to you is that my belief is that one of the biggest challenges that we have in this country and how we address issues of bias is that we engage in self-shaming, and if we're honest, sometimes we intentionally and unintentionally shame others. And my belief is that as long as we continue to do that, human beings would never feel the motivation that they need to do the self-change work or the broader societal change work that we need to do. An implicit bias approach addresses this because it makes the central question not, are you racist or not racist? Are you sexist or not sexist? An implicit bias approach makes the central question, how do we get our actions and behaviors, how do we align our actions and behaviors with our consciously held egalitarian beliefs? Or at least for those people who do hold egalitarian beliefs. My belief is that many people do. So that's why this work is important at this particular moment in time. And in closing, I want to leave you with a quick idea. The late child psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner once said that every child needs at least one adult in his or her life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. Raise your hand if you've had that at any point in your life. And so you know what it feels like. My belief is that not only does every child need that, but every human being needs at least one other human being in their life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. And the only way that we're going to have that is if we do the internal change work that we need to do to make the external change work possible. Thank you very much.
So let's just take a moment to pause and reflect on that video. What's one word that came to mind during that presentation? Now we're going to talk about microaggressions. A microaggression is a subtle verbal or nonverbal behavior committed consciously or not that is directed at a member of a marginalized group and has a harmful derogatory effect. It's important to note that those individuals who engage in microaggressions may or may not be doing it on purpose. Instead, these actions or comments may reflect the biases held by a particular group about other groups of people. In this way, while they're still harmful, the intent of the microaggression is not to harm. In other words, people don't necessarily know that their words and actions hurt. What are some examples of microaggressions? A patient is waiting to see a medical professional in the hospital. A woman enters the room and the patient assumes that she is a nurse instead of a doctor. A person meets someone who is visibly a minority and asks where they are really from. A person is walking down the street and crosses to the other side of the road to avoid someone out of fear because of their outward appearance. A situation where someone tells a person who is LGBTQ that they don't seem gay or other similar phrase. So what are some other examples of microaggressions that you can think of? Let's take a moment here to write some down. Now we're going to do a personal reflection. What stories have you heard about yourself? Have you ever experienced a microaggression? What stories have you told about others? Have you ever perpetuated a microaggression? Have you ever witnessed one take place? Next, we're going to watch this short video, Microaggressions in the Classroom.
time when someone said something about some aspect of your identity that made you feel insulted or slighted? Even if they didn't intend it, you probably experienced a microaggression.
A microaggression is something that someone says to someone else without knowing that it may be offensive. It hurts. So that's how I know it's a microaggression, because it feels disrespectful.
And it's not like outright racism, but it's something that is like almost unconscious in the way that you view people.
Most microaggressions are subtle and indirect, but they occur frequently in the daily interactions of members of historically underrepresented groups. And most often, people who commit microaggressions think of themselves as well-intentioned, non-racist, non-sexist people. They do not realize that the underlying messages communicated by their actions or comments are hurtful to other people.
One of my friends asked if my parents had their papers. I had a science teacher, a physics teacher, and he told me that I was the smartest black girl in his class. I've been asked if I understood what they were talking about, or GA translation and stuff, just based on my name. I'm not the spokesperson for the whole black community, but that's a microaggression I do experience a lot. Like, they want the black perspective, and I'm usually the only black girl in the class. So it's like, okay, what's your take on this?
Oftentimes I get asked, do you know how to speak your native language? And when I answer I do, it's just like, they're like, okay, well, what does Ching Chao mean?
There are 3 types of microaggressions: micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. A micro-assault is similar to what we think of as overt discrimination. In the case of micro-assaults, those acts are intentional.
I was a server for a long time, and if anyone else was, you know this. In the back of the kitchen, like when someone gets a table of, like, say, Indian people, I hope this is PC, I don't know all the terms, but like Indian people or black people or anyone, they'd be like, who wants that table? I don't want it, they're not going to tip. And my heart would break every time.
I used to be a server too, and I hated it because I was like the only person of any type of race other than white. I remember coming in and they'd be like, "Oh, Danielle, you get that table of raccoons," and I was like, "What?" And they were like, "Yeah." And then I would go and I'm like, "They're black people," and I was like, "Wait, is that what you call black people? You call them raccoons?"
A micro-assault can be the deliberate posting of swastikas, Confederate flags, racial slurs or epithets that are left on a blackboard in a classroom.
I work as a research assistant, and so a while ago, one of the new RAs, when I was a few months into it, came up to me and just mentioned that, we'd known each other for months at that point. You're the least scary black guy I've ever met. In the way that I dress, the way that I talk, the way that I speak. I've kind of tailored that over the course of my education to be non-threatening.
I'll literally have my keys in my hand, they're always with me, and I'll just jingle them as I'm walking so that they know that I know that I'm there. So that we both know I'm right here and I'm not going to try and do anything stupid. But on that note, there's also the stigma that we're aggressive and intimidating.
It's sad you have to make sure you let people know you're not a threat. And that's the objective.
One of my friends commented to me, he said, I don't really even think you're black, you're, and I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean? He's like, you're smart, you do your work, yes, you're athletic, but you do your work, you're smart, so I don't really know if you're black. I was like, I didn't understand. It made me question who I was and if I was still a part of the culture.
And that's an example of micro-invalidation and a micro-insult. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit more. A micro-insult is a comment that communicates the demographic group is not respected, that person is a slight exception to the stereotype. It's an insult, even though the perpetrator thinks he has just rendered a compliment.
Well, here at UNT, I've heard, "You're so pretty for a black girl." I feel like it discounts me as a person, and then I feel like it discounts my race. I feel like you can be pretty just because you're a woman, or or all Black women are beautiful, all people of color are beautiful, just the same as people that are not people of color. So for them to make that specific statement, that's what I'm like, what in you made you say that to me, as if it were a compliment.
So another type of micro insult is when students in the classroom are dismissed or treated almost as if they're invisible. For instance, in some of our sciences or engineering classes, there are few women, and professors often don't call on those women.
I had one instance in a statistics-based class where we were discussing something bell curve related, and he presented a question, and I don't remember exactly what the answer was, but I answered it, and he kind of doubted me, and he very condescendingly was just like, "Oh, okay, well, I mean, like, this is the best answer, but I guess your answer could be right. You know what? We'll ask." It was a grad student. He was like, "You know what? We'll ask Dr. So-and-so and see what he thinks the best answer is." And there was no apology or anything. He was just like, "Oh yeah, Dr. So-and-so said that. Yeah, that was actually a really acceptable answer." And I was just like, okay. What else is he going to doubt me on? And when else am I going to be called out in front of 70 other people, and have a weird exchange that makes the whole room quiet? Like,
one of my science classes, my teacher had asked what I wanted to do, and I told the teacher that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and immediately they're like, "That's too hard for you. Maybe you should try a different field, or have you ever thought about being a nurse practitioner?" Nurse practitioners in psychiatry make pretty well. They make a lot of money too. Have you thought about that? Like, why go to med school?
Genuinely, sometimes somebody might feel like they can't make it, and then when you continue to tell them that, it does hurt,
I had a lot of professors tell me to my face that they were surprised that I was as good as a student as I was, and that I pay attention in class and actually participated. And when I asked why, they said, "Well, you just come off as a troublemaker. You have all these piercings and short hair as a girl, tattoos. We just naturally assume that you're really going to be any good."
Another type of micro insult is when a professor says to a student, "Wow, you speak really good English." The message is, the professor thinks I don't really belong here, or that I'm not really American. Of course I speak good English. I was born in the United States. But the professor sees a Latina or an Asian and makes the assumption that that person is foreign, or at least that is what the target hears. What is the underlying message when somebody asks if you're legal?
That you don't belong to this country.
That you don't belong. That's right.
We were walking into the gym once, and I was the guest, so I had to hand the person the ID, and he was looking at my name and everything. He's like, "What are you?" And I was like, "Well, what are you asking?" He's like, "What nationality are you?" I was like, "Okay, I'm Lebanese, I'm Arab."
He's like, "You got one of those that blow things up, are you?" No offense, though. What kind of crazy stuff you ask someone? You get what I'm saying?
And I was just really surprised. Like, it totally blew my mind that someone would think that.
The assumptions I get the most is that I'm very academic and that I'm very good at math. When they assume stuff like that, it makes me feel like they're taking the individual out of who I am and just assuming that all the people who look like me act like me. And that kind of makes me feel lesser of what I can do.
The teacher was asking if someone could translate something in Spanish, because he was giving an example, and he needed this one word to be translated in Spanish. And he just stared at me specifically when he was asking, and I knew we were making eye contact, because after, I just stayed quiet, because I was like, I'm pretty sure there's other people in this class that know Spanish, but he just kept staring at me. And at some point, the rest of the class turned to look at me, waiting for a response, and I was like, I'm not going to give you guys an answer, this is not okay.
Our teacher pulled me aside because they were doing something for Christmas, like Toys for Tots or something, and he had this bicycle. They had a bicycle that were going to give to the kids, and he came up to me and was like, "Hey, I need to switch out the seats on this bike, and it seems like somebody like you would know how to do that. So if you could just change it out for me, that'd be great. And so I was like, oh, okay, sure, not really thinking much of it. And then later on, I kind of thought to myself, that's odd. Why would he assume that I knew personally how to switch, bike seat? Just, so I thought that was an odd kind of maybe a micro insult on the fact that he assumed just because maybe I'm Latino that I'm good with my hands or something.
A micro invalidation is a comment or action that dismisses the experiences of historically disadvantaged group members. Micro invalidations can happen when, for instance, when a student is lamenting that she wishes there were more Latina faculty, for instance, and the students in the class start rolling their eyes or, oh, come on, get over it. And the professor goes along with the students instead of with the person who made the lament. Another type of micro-invalidation, one that we hear a lot about today, is being colorblind. When people say, I don't notice you're black, I don't notice you're Latina, I don't see color. What does that mean? How do you interpret that? What are people saying when they say, I don't notice your race, I don't see color? How do you interpret that?
They're just trying to say that they're not racist, that they don't look at that side of you, they just want to validate you as a person, but it comes off wrong because it's like your race is very much who you are as an individual.
In a lot of my mini classes, I have to do writings, and it's just professors seem to be like don't want to hurt my feelings because I'm an international student, so mine is not that good, especially with my writing. So they let me go easy, I just feel like they have different expectations for international student and just American students. And like a lot of feedback that I get from like my writings is just like not very meaningful. Because I just feel like they just try not to hurt my feelings, try to go easy on me. But then by doing that, I just feel like it takes toll on my development, like my learning, my writing, and art stuff.
So what do you do if you are not the person who commits the microaggression as the professor? What if someone else in the classroom commits it?
What I usually do is I name it. When I hear it in the room, a microaggression that a student says, it may not be directed to a particular student, but there are probably students in the room who will feel as if they have been microaggressed against. I will name that. I think we've just had a difficult comment made that not everybody's comfortable with. What are people feeling in the room right now? Did anyone feel uncomfortable with that? And then if there's silence, which there oftentimes is because people aren't comfortable about calling each other and things, I will talk about what it is that I heard. I will model the behavior of instigating a difficult dialogue. And usually once I do that, then people will come back.
The impact on students that can be harmful is that it creates an uncomfortable environment or climate. It can be very stressful. Some of the research shows that it can affect people's health because of the stress. But I think one of the big things is that you just don't feel like you belong or are included. And, especially when we're trying to create a campus where diversity is valued and where everybody feels included, they get in the way of that goal.
Let's take a moment here to reflect on what we just watched. Take a moment and think about some of the things that you heard, some of the things that you felt, and some of the things that you saw during this video. So what can we do about microaggressions? First, you can notice what you notice. When you see someone for the first time, take a second to list off in your head what you notice about them, especially their characteristics that are different from yours. Your brain is going to pick up on these differences instantly. So if you're aware of that process, you could prevent yourself from getting stuck in it. Question your beliefs. After you've paid attention to what you notice about people, ask yourself what beliefs you may have that might influence what you notice. Why do you believe what you believe? What physical characteristics automatically trigger your brain to make an assumption about the person? Recognize the role of institutions in society. It's important to see how microaggressions interact with institutional and structural racism because that's where the root cause of harm is and where the most harm comes from. It's impossible to thoroughly work to prevent microaggressions without recognizing how society, not just individuals, perpetuates them. Then don't get fooled by colorblindness. The idea that someone can look beyond race because we're all part of the human race, aka colorblindness, may seem like a tempting belief to subscribe to. However, the colorblindness approach also refuses to recognize the dramatically different experiences people have because of race and racism. In doing so, it negates those experiences of those people. And then believe people. People who are part of majority groups can usually go through the day without being reminded of that. For example, a white person can spend the day at work not having to think about the fact that they're white and how others might perceive them because of it. For many people in minority groups, this simply isn't the case. They're constantly reminded of the aspect of their identity that makes them different because of the way others treat them and act around them. So, last, we just believe people. That is the end of our training. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for watching this recording. If you have any questions, you can send them over to us. And please check out our website at www.awcommunities.org.